Hello. I'm wearing my Halloween shirt for you. I hope you see this. This is also my black Magick shirt, so I hope you're all properly frightened by it. I'm going to make just a few introductory remarks, and then Art Johnson will take the first half of the lecture, and then I will come back for the second. He will be focusing on some important historical aspects and some of the classical connections between Kabbalah and Magick. And I will do what I like to do most, which is come out later and make eccentric remarks about Magick and tie it up to personal experience and that sort of thing. I'll start out by saying that the classical Kabbalah, as it's known among the Hebrews, and I'll point out again, as I do ad nauseum, that unless we are 40-year-old Orthodox Jewish practitioners of Orthodox Jewry, we don't know anything about the Kabbalah, because those are the only people who get direct transmission. What we have are the fragments that have escaped, that have been given to us by European occultists who were in contact with some of these rabbis, who found manuscripts and diagrams and matched up what they heard from these people to their own experience. So therefore we have a very comparative system full of a lot of question marks. There is a magical tradition in Kabbalah known as practical Kabbalah. However, the Kabbalists tell us, all of them, that it has been dead, as far as they're concerned, for something like 1,000, maybe 1,500 years, because we live in such crummy times, according to them, that it's no longer safe to practice practical Kabbalah, which is a pretty good warning to those of us who are interested in magical studies. It is possible that there is some form of practice still going on. I would say doubtful. There is now instead an emphasis on meditation in Kabbalah. And as we'll see in this lecture, meditation and Magick are not as different as they may seem. The meditating Kabbalist is doing something very similar to what the practical Kabbalist was doing, and that is the attunement of consciousness to certain states, certain levels of awareness. And so what you're finding is, instead of getting out your magic circle and your wand and all that good stuff and chanting certain names in Hebrew and trying to get a certain angelic presence, as it's called, a certain state of consciousness, instead you're taking permutations of Hebrew letters and, in a sense, confusing yourself into an altered state by repeating these things over and over and over and over again. Later on in the lecture, I will argue that there are much better ways to approach enlightenment than confusing yourself into altered states, much quicker, much simpler, much more enjoyable ways. And I will preface that by saying this, and then I will turn it over to Art Johnson, and that is that the assumption that we have to use magical will or difficult formulas or all kinds of long, lengthy, arduous studies with memorization and foreign languages and risks is an assumption based on the idea that what we are attempting to do is something that God doesn't want us to do, which is become enlightened. If you believe in God, if you believe in a superior being, all-powerful, if you believe in spirit, then you believe that everybody wants you to be enlightened, and you don't have to do all these hard things, that the natural course of life is enlightenment. And so it's sometimes helpful to remember an old Islamic saying, which is that if you take one step toward God, God takes 7 steps towards you. But the key is how you take that step. So without further ado, Art Johnson.
Evening. It is a strange thing that we are all here tonight talking about the Kabbalah. If it weren't for one particular individual in the 19th century, we wouldn't even know what the word meant. The person I'm referring to is the Abbé Louis Constant, a French abbey of the Roman Catholic Church, otherwise known as Eliphas Levi. Eliphas Levi was born in France in 1810, the son of a shoemaker. He showed very precocious intellectual assumptions at an early age, and the monastic life was immediately assumed for him, the life in the church, which was very typical at that particular period in France. But his life is a little bit clouded, and I'm not going to go too deeply into any biographical sketches, because the main point I'm trying to make is that without him and his eclectic, and I use the term not as it's used today, but in the true sense, his eclectic philosophy, whereby he tried to combine Egyptian Masonry, Freemasonry, the doctrine and dogma of the Roman Catholic Church, Kabbalah, Tarot, hints of Rosicrucianism, you name it, he looked into it. He drew from these tenets things that he felt were important, and almost in correspondence, set them side by side, analyzed them in his own very beautiful, poetic way, and his works were translated out of the French by Arthur Edward Waite, a Christian mystic and occultist of the late 19th century in England. One of the members of the Golden Dawn, the group that employed such people as William Butler Yeats, Florence Farr, Arthur Meacham, many very famous writers and actors, actresses, and artists of the time belonged to the Golden Dawn. Eliphas Levi had a very strange concept for his time. It's been expounded upon in this day and age and propped up. He felt that the world would not be able to improve, regardless of any religious or theosophic or magical tradition, until man had an equal respect for his counterpart, woman. He felt that all the ills and the woes of this world were basically attributed to this very thing, that women were subservient to men. This was a real no-no to Eliphas Levi. And it's odd, too, because women were not always his greatest of friends. He was involved in politics at an early age. He was a very proficient and prodigious writer. He believed in a certain type of independence for France, and he was jailed several times previous to his metaphysical studies as a writer. Very similar to Plato in a sense. Plato went down the trail of politics and eventually said, nope, this isn't making it, and went into philosophy and metaphysics. Eliphas Levi, very late in his life, married a young 16-year-old girl by the name of Nicole, who he was madly in love with. The giggles are more than warranted, but if you knew the real story, it would not make you laugh. He had a very high regard and respect for the female deity and the female as deity. He was constantly reprimanding his friends for always talking of the he God, the he virtues. Nicole and he had 2 children. Both of them died early in age, and she left him. He became a pretty famous writer under a male pseudonym, which at the moment escapes me. Wrote several books. But Levi said something very interesting. He said, the Kabbalah is very, very simple. I'll give it to you in a nutshell. The 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, the 10 Sephiroth, and the 4 elements. That's it. Just that simple. Yet how complex. Let's look at something for a second here. My apologies to Pythagoras for a rather lousy practice here. Pythagorean Tetractys, as John Rochlin so eloquently tells us in The History of Philosophy, compiled by Thomas Stanley in 1684, in an article appended to the life of Pythagoras and his philosophy. that numerology plays a very important part in the Hebrew tradition. It's debated as to whether Pythagoras got it from the Hebrews or the Hebrews got it from Pythagoras. John Reichland feels that the Pythagoras got it from the Hebrews. The critical scholars date our knowledge of Kabbalah around 120 A.D. So for Pythagoras, who was living a good 500 to 600 years previous A.D., this would be not too reconcilable. But as Ron said a little bit earlier, everyone has different opinions. The latter-day works on the Kabbalah, anything in the 20th century, I will not say is invalid, but the farther we get away from the root, the more watered down things become. Now, the Tractus was the combination of 1 through 10. 1, the Father. This is in Kabbalah. 2, the Mother. This could be a flow resulting in an idea that results in 3, fruition of the idea. We have our basic Trinity in religion, which we can find through all religions, all world religions. Flowing to the 4, because it has always been the Trinity to want to pass on its goodness, and the logical order comes to the 4. This could be the 4 elements, it could be the world, the 4 rivers running out of Eden. 4 cardinal points, you take a choice. It's all symbolical. And in the Kabbalah, the permutations are combinations of the 10 Sephiroth with the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet in combination with the 4 elements. It has a wondrous effect, so they tell us. Do I know any Kabbalists that have worked magic? No. Am I a magical Kabbalist myself? No. Then why am I studying this stuff? Excellent question. I'm a poet. I'm a musician. I live in a time where I feel imagination is nearly stagnated. Studying these works shoots into my imagination electricity. It's personal. It's very subjective for me. It's not objective. Do I understand Kabbalah from front to back? Nope. But certain parts of it really affect me. And given enough time, I should be able to understand it. Say 20, 30, 40 lifetimes. Now, one interesting thing is the hubbub about magic in general. In the 20th century in particular, with the advent of movies, magic has been passed on to us as funny guys with pointed hats with crescent moons and stars on them, debauching devils, sorcery, witchcraft, etc., etc. Very little said about the light or white side of magic. It's very simple to find an explanation for either of the two. If the art of magic is concentrating the will through subjective or objective ceremony or ritual towards a certain goal or point, and if in accomplishing that we're using it only for our own justification and not to be passed along for the good of others, then we are serving the dark side. If, however, we want more knowledge, we want to improve ourselves, we want to be better people so that we can help those around us, then we're serving the light or wisdom side. In the Star of Solomon, the 6-pointed star, if you put dog in the top point, and in the law of correspondences, macrocosm and microcosm, that reversed in the bottom is dog. And it just means beastly or base desires. We constantly vacillate between the two. That's why we're human beings. But we can always do our best to improve things a little. Very interesting point with the numbers 10 also. Let's look at it this way for a second. I don't have a chalkboard. I have great skill in going off the end of the page. Hey, look out here now. 5 in the middle. Very interesting thing about that 5. the number of justice, of choosing and comparing, and stands midway between the 10. And look what happens. Any combination of a number that comes after it or before it, wanes or waxes, will give us 10. 6 and 4, 10. 3 and 7, 10. 2 and 8, 10. 1 and 9, 10. Actually, I should stop lecturing right there, because if you just think about that for a couple hours, it works magic, you know. Why do people pursue magical practices? Well, I've slightly explained that, some for their own worthwhile selves, and some to possibly embetter the people around them. William Butler Yeats, in his autobiography, said, "Next to poetry, I will make the magical practices the most important thing in my life." Well, how did Yeats use magic, and why? He's known as one of the best English poets of the 20th century, if not the best. Scholars and critics will agree to that. There's been a lot of great poets in the 20th century, but no one with the profound insight of Yeats. He is also, according to Kathleen Raine, the last poet to write in the Platonic tradition, to use the symbols of the Platonic tradition and Hermetic tradition, interchangeable in certain ways, in his poetry. And what does this accomplish? This accomplishes many things on many different levels. In the psychology of William Butler Yeats' poetry, there's a surface poem. It might look like a love poem. As he said in his autobiographies, no matter what I write, whether it be a religious poem or a philosophical poem, it always comes out a love poem. Giordano Bruno, the Hermetic tradition of the 15th century, had a love school of poetry, but they were worshiping Sophia, divine wisdom, and not the female counterpart. But the poems could be read for the surface meaning. When William Butler Yeats first looked into magical practices by going to the museum, British Museum in London, he ran into a rather swarthy gentleman named MacGregor Mathers, who had been doing a good deal of research in Kabbalah. In fact, Nora van Rosencroft's book in Latin was translated by MacGregor Mathers to be one of the cornerstone books in Kabbalah. And at the time, MacGregor Mathers, when he found out that Yeats was very interested in magic, gave him some symbols to hold up to his forehead: a moon, a sun, a star, various other things, and told him that if he concentrated on those symbols or meditated upon them in a certain way, he would be able to reach other states of consciousness. Yeats was skeptic, but willing to go along with an open mind, and discovered that they worked. Many of these devices were used to write his poems, although he didn't lean on that. He was a very scholarly gentleman, very investigative. By the time he was 22 years old, he'd written a 2-volume book with his uncle on the symbolism of William Blake. I mean, you've got to have something going to get that together at that particular age. But nonetheless, this was very important to him. Is it necessary for us to look into magic and to be doing all these weird things, as Ron said, going through a million ceremonies and, speaking in tongues we don't even understand just to impress our friends or something like that? No, it isn't. And he's going to explain why a little later. I'll leave that up to him. Before I'm done with my lecture, however, I am going to create a small experiment. I hope you all have a piece of paper and a pencil handy. If you don't, you can borrow one from a friend. This is not a test, by the way. Well, that'll be coming up in about 5 minutes. I thought I'd warn you now so you could rattle your papers while I'm saying nothing. Of course, I could continue with the lecture, and that would be the same effect. Now, first of all, I want to say something about correspondence and sympathy. These are very important elements in the magical tradition. Physical bodies, it is believed by the Maguses, are bound by invisible cords. And if that sounds a little far-fetched to you, think about the last time you were in love. Think about someone you're in love with now. Think about someone in this room you're very fond of. I will state from personal experience that I do believe in will. I mean, it's a very dangerous thing to tamper with, and the use of it is extremely dangerous, as I said. And I will give a short personal example, and it will not be too long. A few years ago, I was traveling through Europe as a musician, and I met a woman in France, 9,852 miles from my doorstep in Los Angeles. We were very attracted to each other, as human beings can be, and we developed a relationship. The bond was very strong. I never thought I'd see her again. And between the two of us, we willed to see each other again 5 times in the next year. And very strange occurrences happened. One night, I came home and discovered my phone was out of order. I realized it because I'd been sitting home for 4 days and it hadn't rung, and I didn't think I was that unpopular. So I called the phone company and told them, and a guy came out and checked it, and he said, your bell's out on this phone. I don't have a spare phone, so there's nothing I can really do about it, but I can get you a phone tomorrow. I said, fine, whatever. Went to sleep that night and woke up at 2 in the morning for absolutely no reason. I lit a candle and sat up in bed and looked at the phone. I reached over and picked it up, and she was on the other end. Now, the point I'm trying to make is these bonds between people can be very, very strong. I asked her how many times it rang, by the way, and she said 3. Now, I'd like to do a little experiment. That's basically all I have to say on the subject. I would suggest the works of Eliphas Levi translated by Waite. Here's another very interesting thing. When you start to read the works of Levi, you will notice that the footnotes are strewn throughout the entire book, and the introductions are always critical by Arthur Edward Waite. When I was in London 4 years ago at the Atlantis bookshop, I ran into Dr. Israel Rigardi by complete accident. And when he found out that I was studying Mr. Hall's works, etc., he asked me if I'd studied anything by Waite, and I said yes, and Dr. Rigardi looked me in the face and said, poor Arthur, he really missed the point, didn't he? I never understood what he meant until I started really reading some of his translations of Levi. The translations are very good. He knew his French very well, but he didn't know Levi very well. The French intellect is highly influenced with emotion. If Arthur Edward Waite had read more Balzac or Anatole France, he would have understood, I think, Levi a little bit better. As a matter of fact, Balzac's wife was a student and a very dear friend of Levi's. Levi existed by teaching. He led a very modicum life, very low profile, and today in Paris, on the Rue de Saint-Germain, there's still an apartment house that sits there with his little placard on the door. Eliphas Levi, magician. Now, for our experiment. I brought my laundry with me, thinking that you might get some great opinions on soap. One thing that's rarely discussed in magic is the use of music. This instrument I'm taking out here is a Renaissance lute constructed exactly to the specifications of the Elizabethan era. If we think about John Dee, who was the astronomer, magus, astrologer, and mathematician to Queen Elizabeth, we run into his cohort, although he never seemed to meet the gentleman, John Dowland, who was a magician and music. He never worked for Queen Elizabeth because he was always a little bit in trouble with the Queen, so he ended up in Denmark or Bulgaria or wherever. But this music, to me, seems to hit a certain chord inside. At least it does for me. If it doesn't for you, you can all yell boo and I'll go home. It's just that simple. But here's the experiment I'd like to do. I'd like you each to write 4 lines, a quatrain. Now, it could be anything as, I think this lecturer Johnson is really very screwy, and I'll tell you what I'm doing next week, I'm going to a movie. That's fine if you want to do that, that's great. Anything you feel like writing. You do not have to show them to me. You can show them to me knowing that I am a poet. My desire would be that you exchange them with each other. If you care not to write, that's fine. If you care to keep it to yourself, that's fine. But what I would like to see is everybody exchanging them. That would be basically the goal of the situation. And I'd love to see them too on the break if you care to show them. So what I'm going to do is play about 5 minutes worth of music, hopefully, if this thing is in tune. Otherwise, it's, as John Dow once said, anybody who plays a lute for 20 years tunes it for 15. Let's see where we are here. Now, we're in luck, thank you. Okay. These pieces, by the way, are all in the key of G major for a specific purpose. G is the fifth of C, which is the middle zone of music. So I'm going to play, and you can mull around amongst yourselves, and hopefully you'll be doing some writing. If you're not, I hope you're entertained in the meantime. hope you will forgive me for the few mistakes. It's not a concert, so there was no warming up period, so some fingers found other strings, interestingly enough. Music has always been, or not always been, it has often been used in meditation. And in all magical practice, there is, of course, a response to meditation. Whether it's concentrating on a symbol or a talisman, burning of incense, the listening of music, all of these things can aid in that particular direction of refining the inner senses. Beethoven believed music to be pure magic. Mozart believed it to be pure magic. And Schumann said, music is the only true philosophy because it does not require words. Its melodies and its architecture can tone the individual without the use of verbiage. Thank you.
I'll give a brief introduction to the ideas that we'll be talking about in the next section of the lecture, and then we'll take a break. Let's begin by asking, what is magic? I don't mean what sort of people practice magic or what kind of practices can be considered magic, because that will bring us into distinctions between shamanism and magic and psychism and magic and all sorts of different fields and magic. What I mean is, what is the root thing that differentiates magic from any other form of spiritual or religious endeavor? And I think that you'll find, if you study the tradition, that the key word here will be will. The idea is that the magician is using willpower, honed to a very fine degree, to achieve something. Now, it could be said that a meditator is doing something like that, in the sense that certain forms of meditation, particularly in Raja Yoga, involve a person in fixing their concentration on a point until all thought is extinguished. But magic is a little bit different. Most people who study Western metaphysical traditions run first into a big name, Aleister Crowley. Some of them stay with Aleister Crowley, and most of them who do get into big trouble. If you've known anybody who has, you know why. Many discover later that Aleister Crowley was a kind of bugaboo, and they wince whenever they hear his name. Neither case is really true, but Crowley is an excellent study of magic, what it can lead to in a good sense and what it can lead to in a bad sense. In a good sense, if you have ever read any of Aleister Crowley's poetry, which is not particularly good, but which is, of his writings, perhaps the most purely mystical and most honest, you will find that he had tremendous enlightenment experiences. He experienced what might be called cosmic consciousness. He experienced a transcendent presence of love, of a greater being in the world, all those sorts of things. Why, then, did he do such strange things as have his disciples cut themselves with razor blades whenever they said the word I? Why did he get involved in all sorts of ugly rituals and all this sort of thing? And why? Simple. Breaking limitations. A magician is basically somebody who wants to push past every possible limit. They want to see past the barrier people tell them they're not allowed to see past. They want to do the act that people tell them they cannot do. There's usually a very good reason for that, and that is that most magicians are extremely insecure individuals. That is why they are so busy trying to convince everybody that they're powerful, scary, dangerous. Elvis Levy is a good contrast to Aleister Crowley, because the principal point of his character was that he had a great sense of humor. And he once said that you could throw away all the works on magic, all the Kabbalah, throw it all out and read Rabelais. Because if you had a Rabelaisian sense of humor, you had all you needed about metaphysics. If you could laugh at anything, at the worst things that happened to you and other people, then you were a magician. There was a very subtle point there, because magic, like alchemy, is concerned with transformation. In its purest sense, what is called white magic, it is a process of attempting to purify oneself to the extent that with perfect balance, greater and greater and greater states of consciousness can be achieved until finally there is a direct apperception of the spiritual reality. That can be visions, that can be a kind of oracular knowledge of the future, or in its purest sense, it can be a kind of God experience, sort of thing when God touches you. The Sufis say God kisses you when you have that kind of mystical experience. Now, if I were going to draw you a Kabbalistic tree, which I won't because I drew it in the last 4 lectures, and if you want to know about it, you can buy those tapes. It would take too long, actually. That's why I won't do it. But if you rise up the Kabbalistic tree, the 10 Sephiroth, you move from the bottom, Malkuth, balancing the body. This is the magician fasting. Very controlled use of the body, keeping himself toned. 2 weeks of drinking the purest water, eating the purest things, that sort of stuff. Then you move up to Yesod, also on the middle pillar, middle column. At that point, you're purifying the imagination. You're cleansing your thoughts and your emotions, trying to get yourself thoroughly focused on the best things. And then you get up to a balancing point on the left and right pillars, where you're now balancing your analytical mind. In other words, stopping the constant doubting, thinking, analytical functions. And you're also balancing your emotions separate from imagination. In other words, these are just the kind of overbearing moods. For instance, you wake up in the morning and you think, I just don't feel good, that sort of mood. No particular reason. You balance that out. And then you move from there to, on the center column, Tifareth. This is a kind of sense of the presence of self. This is where you begin to get into the essence of me, who I am. When you're an artist, this is where you're creating from. This is artistic expression. When you're talking, especially if you talk too much, you're talking from that place in a sense. You're wanting to express yourself, to make yourself visible to yourself in the world. Any kind of activity that has to do with making yourself visible to yourself, even having children, can be associated with Tifareth. But in this sense, the magician is focusing will, the self-expression of will. In other words, desire to achieve a particular goal, a particular state. You move up from there to, on the 2 outer columns, a balancing of desire in its strongest sense. This means that ambition has to be dealt with. The magician cannot be desiring magical experience because he wants to be powerful. If he does, he throws off balance at that point on the tree. And on the other side, we're balancing this against the desire to have force in the world, to achieve the things that we want. Different from desire. Desire, in a Jupiterian sense, being the desire to simply attract situations, to be in a secure position, for example. But the Mars desire is a desire to be effective in the world, that people notice you, all that kind of stuff. Has to be balanced out. Then you move up to a primary yin and yang, male-female apperception of yourself, where you balance the masculine and the feminine. And here you can see why Eliphas Levi said that until men and women are treated equally in society, the world will be a mess, because until a magician treats his male and female parts just the same equally, the magician is a mess. And then if you manage to balance all that, you have direct apperception of a spiritual reality. An abbreviated trip between Magick and Kabbalah. There are magical traditions, however, outside the European. In India and China, all over, every culture that you touch, you find magicians of various sorts. And all of them are associated with an expression of storming the gates of heaven, that sort of thing. Very seldomly do we find magicians who are content to be where they are, smiling, cheerful, that sort of thing. You usually find magicians dressed bizarrely. They have very intense eyes. That kind of stuff is basically true. The movies sort of messed it up. But even Eliphas Levi was known to wear rather ridiculous-looking robes around the house and that sort of thing. It sort of made him feel the part of the magician. There's nothing wrong with it. It's a ritualistic kind of approach to things. But that's the point of it. It's ritualistic. And here's the real trick to all of this. Most of the magicians in the Western tradition have one thing in common: an extremely powerful Christian background. Eliphas Levi, Catholic, all the way. Aleister Crowley, Plymouth Brethren, who made the Catholics look like liberals. And as a result, they have this idea that God is a very fiery, beastly kind of God that has to be dealt with a strong hand, and that an aspirant after spiritual enlightenment needs to be strong, daring, all those kinds of things. It's sort of the warrior path. But the problem is that the magician in general, in the Western tradition, has nothing to make war against. He's not living in nature, he's living in the city. If he were in nature, he'd be a kind of shaman, and shamans tend towards selflessness because you realize real fast when you go marching through the forest trying to be heroic that you're going to fall on your face. But you can get away with that in the city because there's lots of people who will be impressed by it. You can avoid the ones who aren't. Also, a magician in the city has to contend with a kind of culture shock that can very often lead to a sense of superiority. And all metaphysicians have to be aware of this. We live in a very challenging culture, and it's been challenging for hundreds of years now. There have been some pretty radical changes. The idea being that if you lived in the 12th century and you lived in the 14th century, in most of Europe, you wouldn't have had too different an experience. But the difference between 17th century and 18th century, unrecognizable. 18th and 19th, even more so. 19th and 20th, to the point now that in the 20th century, a person in a certain part of England in 1910 would not recognize it now. Wouldn't even be able to deal with it. The cars and the jets and all kinds of things and the speed of it and television and all that stuff. But even back in Eliphas Levi's time and Crowley's time, there were quick changes in the air. And many people felt, as they did, that you had to dig down deep into the roots of the traditions to discover the truth about things. And what they found in there was the Chaldean tradition of what was called theurgy by the Neoplatonists, and that was a very mysterious practice nobody talked about. It was supposed to get you direct apperception of God, and it was rumored to include conjuring spirits and magic wands and all sorts of stuff like that. And so many magicians, many people interested in that side of things went traipsing off into that degree because they discovered that mysticism and just the general practice of virtues were boring. And they didn't seem to answer the conditions of modern life. When a person gets slapped around enough in modern life, they get angry about it. And if they're a good person, they try to channel that anger into something they consider positive. And if you have before you a whole spread of potential spiritual practices and you're angry, magic is going to be the first one you go for because it promises you a magic word, power. And we're going to talk about power after a short break.
Now we're going to regale you with our poems once again, like it or not. This one is called God's Pieces. A deer drinks cautiously from the mountain stream. Large black flies buzz the corner of a greasy diner. Tulips, marigolds, and daisies blossom in a city park. Women gather, laughing over the game. Voices outblast automobile horns, arguing over right and wrong ways. Puffy white clouds mate across an emblazoned sky. Children walk home from school, eyes of another world. The homeless sleep uneasily folded on bus stop benches, no past, present, future. Virgin fingers interlaced stroll lazily towards the heart. The sun reflects off the edge of our globe faith in boundless color. The moon, creeping into place, breathes life into the ocean's lungs. Why do you pray for inspiration when I lay all I have at your feet?
Just to show that I was not fooling you about showing things, we have a photographer here who showed us a very beautiful photograph last week, and we have a different one this week. That's Chris right over there. And I hope we'll be seeing some more of them. Where is that? If you look carefully, I'll leave this where you can see it. The flag in the center is still, and the others are in motion. And as Chris pointed out, there's a wonderful symbolism there, which I won't ruin by explaining it to you. As usual, no title. When you lie in darkness, weeping, afraid of the pain the next moment will bring, 10,000 hands stretch out to help you, but you cannot see them through your tears. When you rush down the road, hungry for wealth, a man or woman, fame or power, cursing the obstacles in your path, a clear road lies open before you, but you cannot see it through your agitation. When you dream of having eyes that can see around the world into the past and future, of ears that can hear words spoken in the far distance, you do not realize you have such eyes and ears, but cannot use them because desire for them blinds and deafens you. How will you end this hunger and thirst when all the oceans and mountains cannot fill it? The outside world's too small. Eat and drink the inside world, and do it artfully. Then the chef of inside and out will come from his kitchen to greet you with a smile. Friend, how can you taste honey when your tongue is thick with mud? Well, we left off on the subject of power. I'm going to do something that I've been just straining to do since the first lecture. And if you have been here since the first lecture, you have perhaps noticed this straining, and that is to completely rip away from the subject. And that is because, I will have to justify it, Kabbalah and Magick are forms of practice that have fossilized in a sense. First of all, they are peculiar to a certain ethnic tradition, and we are living in a world that is rapidly approaching universality. That means that if you wish to be able to communicate between spiritual traditions, you must know more than one spiritual tradition. You can have a favorite one that you study with particular depth, but it's very wise to have access to others. If you love the Kabbalah, it's good to study a little Tibetan Buddhism. If you like Sufism, it's nice to have a little, maybe even Eskimo shamanism under your belt, something really different. Because what we're attempting to do at this point is not simply to achieve a kind of awareness of the divine presence, but to be effective also in the outside world. There seems to be something in the air, is what I'm getting around to. And that something in the air is a kind of dynamic that works this way. And it could be argued that it's always worked this way. In order to achieve your own enlightenment, you must be of service to others. You must be helping other people to understand themselves. And the difficulty with Kabbalah and with Magick is that they are extremely involved, introspective systems that generally produce people who are not capable of communicating their experiences to others. And as a result, they're not good to anybody. Now, I will argue that this has been true from the very beginning. That what we have in Jesus, for example, is an Essene, or someone raised in basically Essene environment, who rejected the convoluted system of their laws, realizing that that wasn't where the essence of things was. That it is not that we have to obey precise laws, perform precise practices to achieve what we must achieve in our work toward enlightenment. It is instead the things that we do for each other that matter. So when Jesus came out and said, love thy neighbor, when he came out and talked about truly giving, truly feeling charity, and all those sorts of things. He was laying the old fossilized approach into its grave, and unfortunately then had his teaching fossilized by a sequence of churches. Kabbalah and Magick are iconoclastic systems. To perform magic correctly, you must have tremendous solitude. A lot of time. You can't afford silly conversation. You can't afford to be worried about other people's problems. It doesn't work. To perform Kabbalah well, you have to have lots of time and solitude. Study, 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 study. Now, it might, first of all, laugh. Go ahead. I laugh all the time. As a matter of fact, this is an excellent, God, it was delightful. Timing is so good. Here's a good example of what I'm talking about. About 3 years ago, at PRS, we had a Tibetan Lama, a meditation master, who had been 20 years in the Himalayas, that sort of thing, and a Jungian analyst debating on stage. It was a very serious occasion. They had Eastern music and all kinds of stuff. They had a friend of Jung up there introducing everybody, and it was just terribly serious. I laughed my way through the first half of it, much to my own embarrassment, because everybody was staring at me as if I was insane, and perhaps I was. But the amazing thing to me was that these people were not talking to each other. It wasn't a debate at all. The Tibetan was talking Tibetan stuff, and the Jungian was talking Jungian stuff, and never the twain shall meet. They never even got close. That's being bound into systems, and that's what we're trying to discuss here. The study of comparative religion, comparative mythology, and mysticism is excellent because it helps you to get rid of the rind in the fruit. But if you study one system, you tend to get caught up in the rind. Most people attracted to comparative religion, to Kabbalah, to Magick, are people who are very intellectually oriented. And people who are intellectually oriented are off balance. And being off balance, they don't laugh in the appropriate moments, like when things get pompous or that sort of thing. They also do not perceive the real depths in life. I've said it many, many, many times that at any given moment, there is all the teaching you need around you, just in what you see. Human knowledge, even human personality, is so dazzling in its depth and its variety. And when you add to that nature, the world of art, the skies, everything, you have all the learning you could possibly hope for. And then when you think about it, you realize that any form of intellectualization, whether it be a materialistic philosophy or Kabbalah or Magick, is an escape from yourself and your situation. You're here in a certain place with certain abilities and certain opportunities for a reason. The Kabbalah and Magick and comparative religion can help you to understand yourself better, help you then to be more sensitive to your opportunities and to apply your talents more completely. But the problem is that too often people become lost in the system. They forget that the system is intended to serve them, and they begin to become servants of it. So everything they do is put into this Kabbalistic basis. Everything is understood in terms of Kabbalah. They have to translate their experience into Kabbalistic terms. This is not the idea. In the European tradition of Magick, there was a lot of stuff that really pissed off Christianity, because there was a lot of pagan practice going on. A lot of magicians like the idea of raising the dead. Now, what do they mean by raising the dead? Usually you picture somebody out in a graveyard with a wand, and there's a plate in the big book like that, and there's all these spirits rising up. It's kind of Disneyland-like. But raising the dead really has more to do with trying to get a spirit to do what you want it to do, to tell you about the future, or tell you what you're supposed to be doing in a certain situation, or just impart some form of wisdom, that kind of thing. The practice of using spiritual rituals to gain power is illogical. It may seem obvious to some of you. I'll explain it. It is illogical because we are embodied spirits. What that means is that we are not at full strength. As the Neoplatonists love to point out, when you're in the body, you're confused. You don't remember where you came from. You don't know where you're going. You don't remember why you came down here. You're weak. And what you do in your spiritual practice, which is really being nice to each other and those kind of virtues, is you open up your awarenesses. The way that works is quite simple. If you're busy hating everybody in the world, then you don't appreciate everybody in the world. You miss the whole point. For example, you may be driving down the freeway, and you see another of those lovely housing complexes that were undoubtedly made by someone who had an overactive intellect because they are perfect geometrics, all stuffed one next to the other, not even a place for a little tree to squeak out. Your initial reaction is, how stupid. I mean, really? I think by now they would have figured out that that's a terrible way to expect people to live. But you then avoid a whole sequence of other potential explanations. And here's a real simple one. How about the people who live there need to be in that compressed environment in this particular time in their lives because they need that kind of pressure. They need to live right next to the freeway because they need that kind of pressure. You may have an experience in your own past where you lived in a terrible situation, and you will look back on it and think, yeah, it was bad, but there were certain things I learned there I wouldn't have learned otherwise. I needed that pressure. So the root assumption that I'm suggesting here is that the magician who says, I'm going to use this particular Kabbalistic symbol to raise this particular angel or demon to do this deed for me, is probably provoking hilarity on the other side of life. It's quite possible that there's whole legions of mischievous little spirits out there, foul-tempered little creatures who love to see us being fools, who will make it appear that there's all sorts of goings-on. But if you think about the fact that a normal human being, if you walked up to him with a special spiritual sigil and said, you're going to do, you'd laugh, you'd say, no, I'm not. It would take a rather mean-tempered soul to say, oh, yes, indeed, and then play a trick on you. That's probably what happens in those cases, because, I want to stress again, we are here in a particular matrix, a particular situation, to do and to learn things peculiar to ourselves. As a result, we have a kind of veiled limitation of our abilities to see and to understand the world. If you've had any form of mystical experience, out-of-the-body experience, anything of that sort, then you know, beyond a shadow of a doubt, the power of spiritual force. You know it. You have absolutely no doubt, and armies of great logicians and philosophers can tell you how you're wrong, and you don't care because you have felt it. If you haven't felt it, then you can wonder about it, you can hope to experience it someday, and of course, when you least expect it, that's when you'll experience it. But it's unmistakable. You have no doubt about it. And the main point of mystical experience is it brings tremendous humility. You suddenly realize that you are not in control of your life. Free will is something that happens when you choose your life, maybe. When you're actually down here, the further along you get in the development of your consciousness, the more you see it's all working in a particular direction. The right phone call comes at the right time. The really ugly situation you got involved in to teach you a certain talent that emerges 20 years later and turns out to be just the thing. And when you cultivate sufficient awareness, you suddenly see that it all works as a kind of mandala, a perfectly balanced picture. Now, I can say that until I turn blue, and if you have not had the perception, it may seem very far-fetched. So the question then becomes, how do you get the perception? That's where most magicians trip. That's where the Kabbalists trip, because what they're after is the perception. That's where all these practices come in, all the arduous work. Perhaps 1,000 years ago, the atmosphere was different. Perhaps the world wasn't spinning quite as fast. I really don't know what to tell you. Perhaps it was necessary to spend 30 years with your nose in books to have these kinds of experiences. I doubt it. But these days, it is not necessary. In fact, a lot of people are discovering that they're kind of being forced on them. The simplest form of practice and the most effective, if you indeed wish to discover who you are, what you're here for, where you're going, what your service should be, can be reduced to a couple very simple things. One, what might be called spiritual alchemy. This means that you really work on your temperament, on your personality. You refine your intellect. You refine your emotions. You get a little creativity in your life, whatever, painting, writing, anything at all, something that allows you to express yourself in a nonverbal manner. You read all sorts of different things. Try to expose yourself to different situations and different people, expanding your consciousness in a very practical way without having to use any kind of exotic means. You especially work on the virtues of kindness and patience. You work on really listening to people and really seeing them. And maybe above all, you work on really listening and seeing yourself. You've got to learn to recognize the different voices inside. You have to learn when you eat too much of this, you start to feel funny. And the next morning you wake up grumpy. Most people don't even notice it, and they're surprised when they get heart disease or cancer somewhere down the line. You have to pay attention to the fact that you may be over-involved in intellectual matters or too little involved. You have to pay attention to whether you are too involved in your own desires and ambitions and not paying enough attention to other people's. You have to become aware of the people you don't like and ask yourself why you don't like them. And you will normally discover that they are inside you. And the things you don't like in them are the things you don't like about yourself. And all of this should be done with a great sense of humor. Because if I could engrave 2 sentences in the sky for everybody to see that would be the par excellence practice of spirituality, the first one would be, do unto others. That's the greatest magic you will ever find. If you practice that every single day, in each situation, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, you're going to be right on the right track. And then below that, if you're real serious about this, guess what? God's laughing at you. Because this creation is full of humor. And the most important thing is to be able to laugh at yourself and to laugh at other people and at yourself laughing at other people and all that sort of thing, and at other people laughing at you. Very important. Humor. This is all the talk about selflessness in Buddhism, killing the ego. What does all that really mean? It means that you stop being infested with concerns about your ambitions, what you want to achieve in life. It means that you learn to laugh at yourself and to see yourself objectively. It means that you realize you're not perfect, you're not going to die if someone insults you, that in fact you can learn a great deal when someone insults you. And in many spiritual traditions, you learn that it is the people who are your enemies that are your greatest friends, because they point out your weaknesses to you. Your friends are just sitting there smiling and telling you how great you are as you drown in your faults. But your enemies will point out immediately, well, you're an impatient so-and-so and this sort of thing, and listen to them. Don't make up reasons why they're wrong. So we have spiritual alchemy. Very simple practice, very difficult. It means learning to drive on the freeway without cussing people out and yelling and screaming. It means really paying attention to every little aspect of life. What color is your room painted? What sort of objects are in it? Are they inspiring? Do they make you feel good or do they depress you? How do you dress? Does the way you dress make you feel good or does it depress you? Do you eat correctly? How about the water that you're drinking? Do you sleep properly? Do you spend too much time watching television? How's the balance of your activities creatively, emotionally, intellectually? Do you do a little bit of everything, or is there just one thing you do all the time? Are you organized with your time or disorganized? Very basic, down-to-earth, boring spiritual questions. But these are the places where the real inroads happen. When you begin to transmute your bad attitudes, you refine your consciousness, and suddenly you have sensitivities that you never knew you had before. You start to notice things. And then all those things that people talked about, their visions and the spirits they were seeing and all that stuff, well, you start to see things. And you suddenly realize, well, I guess it is always there, but it's a question of whether one is open to it or not. A good way to think of it is this. If you always have your face down and you're staring at the ground before you, you're not going to see what's in the sky around you. It's just that simple. And most people find a ground to stare at. It can be worries, it can be financial dilemmas, it can be the desires that they feel for another human being, it can be any number of things, memories. Television is a big one. And they focus 90% of their attention on that thing. And then they're surprised when they don't have the kinds of experiences that other people have. They're surprised when they don't perceive things as delicately as other people can perceive them. There is absolutely no reason why everybody in this room couldn't develop a tremendous degree of spiritual awareness. I mean, we're all Buddhas here. The only thing that prevents us from being Buddhas, in actuality, is our disbelief in that, our lack of focus. Because to be a Buddha, you must have a Buddha's consciousness. And a Buddha's consciousness is free of attachment. And what are attachments? Attachments are things that we choose as being more important than ourselves. There are people who will sacrifice everything in their lives to have a certain article of clothing because it will just impress everybody to pieces. There are people who will break up marriages over their business ambitions. In other words, they are placing inanimate entities over their own development, happiness, presence, let alone that of other human beings. So, spiritual alchemy, number one, practicing the virtues. Then we add to that something very magical that has been discussed over and over and over again in every single religion under different names, and we can lump them together as meditation and prayer, whichever one you favor. Now, normally, a person who begins the study of comparative religion, who has an intellectual bent, the attitude toward prayer is, oh, come on, prayer, that sort of thing. And when they're told by mystics, oh, I'm telling you, it's powerful stuff, they say, no. Mm-mm. Now then, they go and they meet a Tibetan meditation master or a Zen master, and they're told, oh yes, meditate and visualize this, and they say, oh, now that I'll do, not realizing that's the same exact thing that the prayer the Christians are talking about. Prayer is a kind of commitment to putting spiritual things first. It's really that simple. You say to yourself, I'm going to spend roughly 10 minutes every morning when I get up. I don't care what happens, it's first priority. That is going to happen. If I have to skip showering, if I have to be late to work, if I have to really piss off my next door neighbor because whatever, those 10 minutes will be spent in this state. And that's a kind of pact that one makes with the powers that be. It's saying, I know where my priorities are. I'm going to remind myself. Now, I'll give you an example of a kind of prayer that's very simple and very effective. Start out by finding yourself in a nice, comfortable position. And I might add that you might pay attention to east and west. Some people really like to face the east, and there's a major difference for them. And if you do it twice a day, then you might try both east and west at different times, see what is good for you, what feels good. This doesn't mean any super mystical thing like, if you're facing east, you suddenly hear these voices, that sort of thing. It just means what feels comfortable to you, or you like it. Get nice and comfortable. You can sit full lotus if that's good for you. You can sit in a chair, whatever is good. Anything that makes you feel alert and comfortable. Relax the muscles, not in any long, drawn-out thing. Just kind of shake around a little bit, get the tension out. Close your eyes, leave them open, whatever you prefer. Breathe slowly. If there's some sound you like, if you like the Tibetan mantra, Om Mani Padme Hum, or the Sanskrit mantra, if you like the Lord's Prayer, whatever you happen to like, you might use that, repeat it, just to get a certain tone. And then, relax. Don't fight your thoughts. If you start thinking about the laundry or about this or that, fine, notice it, don't fight it. As soon as you notice it, drop it, though. And then slowly turn your mind to thinking about the way things have worked out for you in the recent past. Think about especially fortuitous situations. For example, boy, I was down to my last dollar and then I got this phone call. That happened 5 years ago, but I'll never forget that. And say to yourself, maybe, just maybe, the world takes care of you if you're open to let it take care of you. You don't have to believe it, just tinker with the idea. Maybe even say to yourself, boy, what if that were true? Wouldn't that be great? I mean, what if the stuff that Jesus said about the sparrow and all that was true? I mean, that if you take care of business, do unto others, you'll be taken care of. You'll notice that as you begin this practice, the occasions will multiply and you'll have plenty to think about. And then you might sink into a nice, sincere asking. Ask whoever you want. Ask your overself, ask Spirit in general, ask God, or just say, hey, you out there, whoever's out there, if anybody's listening. Again, you don't have to believe. Just try it sincerely. Say, if you're there, I'd like to just point out that I'm having a terrible time with my temper down here, and I'd really like to have some help. And see what happens. Give it a week or two, maybe even a month. I guarantee you, if you couple that with spiritual alchemy, with working on your personality, you're going to be shocked at the changes. And there will be times when you laugh out loud because of the ways that you are helped. It's strange things. The reason for that is quite simple. In the metaphysical tradition, we are told two things. One, that only a certain percentage of ourselves reaches embodiment. That we are not a soul in a body, we are a body in a soul. There's a lot of soul out here that's not involved in the body, and that most of us in our general personality are not conscious of. It's kind of sitting there. You meet it in your dreams quite often, as a matter of fact, when you have these gallivanting experiences. But it's kind of sitting there and twiddling its thumbs, watching you make a fool out of yourself time after time again. And one day you say to it, hey, how about some help? And it does. It helps you. You have a dream that explains something to you if you pay attention to it. You suddenly get an idea that's just the right idea. You suddenly discover that you're able to handle your temper. No particular reason, just all of a sudden you feel a little bit more relaxed. There's that kind of presence active all of a sudden. The second thing that we're told in the metaphysical tradition is that when you die, because you're immortal, you become spirit. You lose the sheath, this kind of sticky web of body and sensations, and you become consciousness, free consciousness. If you are an artist, you know that free consciousness, as free as you can get it, is very powerful stuff. Very powerful stuff. If you're a historian, you can take a look at someone like Adolf Hitler, who was able to free a great deal of consciousness force. He was a kind of medium. Got up there and sucked up all the energy of the crowd and blasted it back to them. All through history we have examples of this sort of force of spirit, we might call it, for good or bad. Now, if you've got all these spirits running around, stands to reason that some of them are concerned with affairs down here. Reason being that, as has been shown throughout history, if there wasn't somebody helping us, we'd all be dead. We're doing our best to kill ourselves, politically, socially, every way you can imagine. Food, pollution, it's all there. And yet there is some reason why we keep surviving. The breaks keep happening at the right times. 3 scientists in 3 different parts of the world think up the same invention at the same time, and that invention leads to fill in the blank, and fill in the blank saves us from this particular situation. Happens over and over and over again. Now, go a little bit deeper and think about your Albert Einsteins and think about your great artists and what they say about their experience, their genius. They all say the same thing. They say, I don't know, I don't do this stuff. A great artist says, I just kind of sit down and then I see what I'm going to do. Mozart used to say that he got a whole symphony like that. Perfect gestalt. He just saw the whole thing beginning to end, and then he had to sit down and write it out. Great many authors, poets, they get the whole thing, just there it is, and they write it down. Albert Einstein used to always say that he didn't know where it came from. He had a curious disposition. He always wanted to know, well, gee, I wonder what, wide open. And in it all poured. I mean, when the guy was walking through the campus of Princeton and someone asked him, "Have you had lunch?" and he answered, "I don't know, which direction am I walking?" This is a person who is egoless. I mean, he's out in the other regions. Now, the suggestion here is that the key, then, to great creativity, whether it be scientific or artistic, is openness, egolessness. It's simply letting go. Whether you're a great carpenter, a great poet, or a great scientist, depends on how much you can be, as they say, like a child. How much can you just let go and have fun? Play with the subject. Really have fun with it. There's a trick with the Kabbalah. If you really do love the Kabbalah, and I should say, after all my disparaging remarks, that the Kabbalah is a great key to the world. Astrology, Kabbalah, put those two together, add the tarot, and you've got a tremendous philosophy of life and an unparalleled way of interpreting dreams and visions and just everyday experiences, if you can play with them. And that means that you've got to be willing to pick up the Kabbalistic tree, pick up all the diagrams and all the numerology, and throw it out the window just like that. And say, okay, what if it's all wrong? What does it mean to me? Let me try and figure it out for myself. I'm not going to memorize what other people said. I'm going to just figure out what it means for me. What could it have possibly meant? That's when you begin making real progress. You begin to discover things that other people perhaps knew but didn't talk about. You make it real. You make it fun. Because the whole point of being down here is associated, again, with learning and service, with expansion or the refinement of this particular plane of being. You're refining yourself, you're being refined, and hopefully you're contributing to the refinement of others. And I will suggest to you that even if you're the nastiest person who was ever born, that's exactly what you're doing. You're refining others. Because there are some people who are only refined through suffering, and you're inflicting all the suffering you can on them. And that works. That's the way a lot of people reach spirituality. They suffer so much that they finally try it, because it's like, I'll try anything at this point. I'm that miserable. So somebody's got to do all that infliction of suffering. And you might notice, for example, that if you look into history, you have these tremendous wars. You have your Genghis Khans sweeping across the steppes of Asia and sweeping down into Persia and creating terrible bloodshed and suffering. Well, first of all, if you believe in the metaphysical tradition, if you believe in spiritual immortality, it's not really that big a deal. I mean, yeah, you get killed, it's an unpleasant experience, but then you pop back down and do something else again. But beyond that, historically, these conquerors, despite the suffering they inflicted, opened tremendous new veins of energy in the world. They brought new mythologies, new religions, new ways of feeling the world together. Where you had very insulated kingdoms with no contact between each other, suddenly you had ripped open kingdoms with tremendous communication between each other. You had religions being shared. Whole cultures mixing. And if indeed what we are attempting to achieve on this earth is a kind of planetary consciousness, then obviously the first necessary steps were to open up communication between nations, between places. Now, of course, these days it's a lot easier. We have televisions and satellites and radios and all kinds of stuff like that. But if you wanted to know about Tibetan religion a couple thousand years ago, you had to go hiking for about 6 months through the desert, and that's if you were lucky enough to be somewhere like Egypt or Palestine, that area. It was a very difficult thing to do. And a good way to do it was to attach yourself to a conqueror's army. And so we have Plotinus, one of the greatest of all Neoplatonists, following conquering hordes India-ward. Didn't actually make it because the hordes didn't make it. But there were always religious figures, philosophers, teachers following these great historical movements. They're kind of adventurers of a different sort. They were interested in what might be found there for a very simple reason. They knew that the people who really had an understanding of the world, who had divine apperception, would be safe. They would see it coming. They would know where to go, and even if they didn't get there, they would be the most likely ones to survive because they'd know what to say. They'd be alert. They'd be awake. Everybody else be asleep. And so you could go to a nation that had been decimated and still find spiritual teachers hiding up in the mountains and that sort of thing. And in fact, this is what happened in Persia, when the Mongol hordes swept down and destroyed whole cities in Persia. I mean, absolutely obliterated the culture. If you have ever wondered why the tremendous, tremendous learning and culture of Islam became so degraded and is only now beginning to recover, that's why. Because there were whole cities of millions completely wiped out down to the bricks. It's taken them hundreds of years to bounce back at all. But the mountains around those cities were riddled with Sufi teachers. And people who escaped from those cities, guess where they went? Right to the Sufi teachers. It was good for the Sufi teachers, and it was good for the people. Because what happened was that Sufi teachers who had been hiding from everybody up there with their disciples suddenly became leaders of communities. They shared their teachings. They tried to comfort the suffering. And as a result, we have many doctrines that we would not have had if that had not occurred. So even suffering, then, is a way of refining. But it's much nicer if you can be on the right side of all this and be doing it because you want to and not because you're a miserable wretch. And so you have to actually set out to help people. You say, well, do on to other things. You say to yourself, well, I've not had a very good time of it. I haven't had a lot of opportunities. I've been set upon by people a great deal. I've had to deal with a tremendous amount of stupidity in my life that was painful, damaging to me. Where do I go from there? Well, you begin by saying, how would I have liked those people to treat me? What would I have preferred? They would have listened to me. They would have given me a chance. They would have been open to opportunities. They would have been a little more awake. And you say, okay, well, somebody's got to start. Might as well be me. I'll be more awake. I'll be kinder. I'll listen harder. And then you become that most wonderful of all things, an example. All of a sudden, people see that you're a little bit different. And you'll have some alert friends that will say right away, what are you doing? I mean, your art has improved, or you're just a nicer person, or why all of a sudden you listen to me when I talk to you? You never used to listen to me. And those friends, you take them by the hand and mislead them in the direction that you're going, or whatever, it depends. I mean, sometimes you have people who go along with you down the wrong paths, and then you both kind of look at each other and say, whoops, let's go back to the main street and try again. That's okay, too. Sometimes they turn into your teachers. Actually, all students and teachers synonymous. Sometimes the teacher learns, sometimes the student learns. Then you will have other friends who will get angry with you for changing. They will tell you, oh, you're getting weird. You know, you're losing it. I mean, you know, you're getting into that hoochie-coochie stuff. That's no good. But that's an example for them, too, because somewhere down the road, it'll be ringing in their ears and remember things that you said. And it's a great test for you, for your patience, for your kindness. Do you get irritated about it when they disbelieve you, or are you pleasant about it? Do you have sympathy for them? Do you understand their disbelief? Do you honestly and sincerely try to communicate experience to them? Or do you stand around saying, look, let me read off this list of intelligent people. I mean, I've read these people. I mean, shouldn't you believe me? You know, that sort of thing. Or do you say, well, look, I had this experience. And this experience made me believe that such and such was the case. And it changed my life. And then you'll have people who treat you exactly the same for 2 decades. And then all of a sudden one day say to you, you know, you're different. And you say, yes, I am different. And you don't sit there for 2 decades marveling at their stupidity every chance you get, saying to your other friends, my God, can you believe what an ignoramus that person is? You don't do that. You just say to yourself, well, they're off into other things. They're not stupid, because the point of the matter is that you have realized that it is not that the world is stupid. It is you who are stupid. And you will likely remain stupid for the next 100 incarnations. As a matter of fact, the Buddha was probably stupid, because an embodied human being is foolish. It's a foolish situation to be in. Congratulations. We're here in kindergarten, folks. So we might as well behave like kindergartners and have a good time. Not be so deadly serious about it. And so what you realize is that your friends who are off into other things are right where they need to be, and you are content to leave them there. And so all those people who used to irritate you to pieces are now opportunities for you to see the workings of divine law. Every time it irks you, every time you turn on the television set, whatever it is, every time you feel that rise of temper, notice it and say, all right, what might be an alternative explanation? I mean, why might this be happening? Pick out something that's really annoying and say to yourself, what could be some other reason that this could happen? If you can't figure it out, ask somebody else. Ask about it during your prayer meditation. You might get an answer. In a nutshell, then, to close, what I'm suggesting is that whatever spiritual practice you choose, play with it. And the reason that magic is so dangerous, as everybody always warns you, is because it's so serious. And if you can reach enlightenment laughing, why should you avoid that in favor of reaching enlightenment frowning? So openness, laughter, warmth, and most of all, a willingness or a desire to cooperate with the world and with yourself. Saying to yourself, okay, I'll start from the assumption that I'm stupid, and let's see where we wind up. That is the beginning of true spiritual practice. Thank you, and good night.